Look, I'm not paranoid. I'm a survival strategist with pattern recognition skills honed over 3 decades of keeping fragile alien biology from collapsing in the deep black. And every night at 2200 station time, the entire human crew of the UNS Perseverance stops breathing. Not slows down. Stops. I've checked. I've monitored. I've recalibrated my equipment 17 times because I was certain, absolutely certain, that my sensors were malfunctioning. They weren't. At 2200, like some kind of synchronized biological shutdown, 47 humans scattered across this vessel simply cease. My name is Dr. Zephon, and I've been a xenobiologist for the Galactic Assembly for 12 years. I've studied the crystalline metabolism of the VIX. I've documented the binary consciousness of the Kelthran. I've even survived 3 months observing the caustic atmosphere breathers on Station Gamma 9, where the air itself could dissolve Vathari chitin in under 40 seconds. But humans are something else entirely. The first night it happened, I thought I was witnessing a mass casualty event. Some kind of silent weapon, maybe. A chemical leak. A catastrophic life support failure that somehow didn't trigger any alarms. I was stationed in the medical bay, reviewing the day's bioscan data when the ambient noise of the ship changed. You know that sound a vessel makes when it's alive? The hum of voices through bulkheads, the shuffle of boots on deck, plating the distant clang of someone dropping a tool in engineering. It all went quiet. Too quiet. I'm Vathari. My species doesn't do quiet. We need constant mental stimulation, constant data flow, constant proof that the universe is still ticking along the way. It's supposed to. Silence means something has gone catastrophically wrong. Silence means someone is dying. I grabbed my medical scanner and ran. The corridors were empty. Emergency lighting cast everything in that sickly blue-green that makes my photoreceptors ache. I could hear my own footsteps, 4 limbs clicking against the deck in a rhythm that sounded way too loud, way too panicked. The crew quarters were 3 decks down. I took the access ladder because the lift seemed too slow, my manipulator limbs trembling as I dropped through each level. The first door I tried was the engineer. Human male designation Rodriguez, 31 standard years. I'd scanned him just that morning. Perfectly healthy. Cardiovascular system operating within normal parameters. Neural activity optimal. I keyed open his door. He was lying on his bunk, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, not moving. I rushed to his side scanner, already active, and the readings made my primary heart skip. Core temperature 36.1 degrees Celsius, down from his normal 37.0. Heart rate 54 beats per minute, down from his normal 78. Respiratory rate 12 breaths per minute. Shallow. So shallow, my scanner kept losing the signal. I'd seen these readings before, 6 months ago, on Station Kelvin 7. Different species, same progression. My manipulator limbs were shaking as I moved to the next quarters. The pilot. Same thing. Curled on her side, utterly still, a thin line of clear fluid seeping from the corner of her mouth. The navigator, the communications officer, the weapons specialist, every single one of them, lying in the darkness, cooling down, breathing so faintly they might as well have stopped. And their brain activity? Oh, ancestors preserve me their brain activity. Long, slow waves, delta patterns. The kind of neural signature I'd only ever seen in 2 contexts: medically induced comas and the final moments before systemic shutdown. I ran for the captain's quarters. Captain Garrett Hawke, human male, 43 standard years. Former military based on the scars and the way he carried himself. 3 months ago, he'd personally pulled me out of an airlock malfunction, held me steady while I was venting atmosphere and losing consciousness, and didn't let go until medical arrived. I owed him my life, and he was dying. They were all dying. His door hissed open. The room was dark temperature, set 5 degrees below what I'd consider survivable. He was on his bunk, twisted into this strange defensive posture, limbs drawn in, head tucked against his chest like he was trying to protect his vital organs from some unseen threat. I let out a sound I hadn't made since my larval stage, a high-frequency distress call that my translator probably couldn't even process. My species doesn't have words for that kind of fear. We just scream. The corpse on the bed jerked upright. Zephon, what's happening? His eyes were wide, unfocused, blinking rapidly in the dim light. His chest was heaving, drawing in air like he'd been drowning. I stared at him. At this human who had been dead, clinically measurably dead by every metric I understood, and was now sitting up, talking, looking at me with what I can only describe as annoyed confusion. "They're all dead," I stammered, pointing back toward the corridor. My translator was struggling with the pitch of my voice. "The crew! I found them, one by one. They're all dead." Hawk rubbed his face with both hands. His palms made this wet sound against his skin. "Zephon, buddy, they're not dead. They're asleep." Asleep. The word existed in my database. I'd seen it defined in human medical texts. A temporary voluntary reduction in consciousness. A period of reduced metabolic activity. But the clinical definition didn't match what I was seeing. Didn't match the cooling bodies and the failing hearts and the brain waves that looked exactly like, "You shut down your brains," I said. The words came out flat, mechanical. My secondary processor was having trouble keeping up with the cognitive dissonance. Every night, voluntarily. Yeah. Hawk let his head fall back against the bulkhead with a soft thud. A sound escaped his chest, low, rumbling. It took me a full 3 seconds to recognize it as laughter. Deep, exhausted, utterly bewildered laughter. We shut down our higher functions to conserve energy. It's when our brains process information from the day, repair cellular damage, regulate hormones. If we don't get at least 6 to 8 hours of it, we start to die. He paused, looked at me with those strange bilateral eyes. And I really need those 8 hours right now. So unless the ship is actively on fire or we're being boarded by hostile forces, I'm going back to sleep. Good night, Zephon. He lay back down, closed his eyes, and within 60 seconds his heart rate was dropping again. 70, 60, 55. I stood there in his quarters watching my scanner display, trying to understand what I'd just learned. They do this every night. Every single night, 47 humans aboard this vessel willingly walk themselves to the edge of death and call it rest. I didn't sleep that night. Vathari don't sleep. We have rest cycles where our metabolic rate decreases by about 15%, but we remain conscious, alert, aware of our surroundings. The idea of completely surrendering consciousness, of shutting down the very thing that makes us who we are, is about as appealing as voluntarily stopping our hearts. Which apparently is exactly what humans do. Both things. Every night. By morning, I'd made a decision. I had to understand this. Not just document it for my research file, but truly understand it. Because 6 months ago on Station Kelvin 7, I'd made a mistake that cost someone their life. Her name was Dr. Lyris. Crinth, female, 28 standard years, brilliant xenochemist and my mentee. We were studying the metabolic cycles of deep space traders when she started acting strange. Sluggish, unresponsive. Her core temperature was dropping. In my panic, my certainty that I was watching her die, I administered a broad-spectrum stimulant. I killed her. What I didn't know, what I should have known, was that Crinth enter a hibernation cycle every 47 days. Their metabolism slows, their temperature drops. It's completely normal. necessary even. The stimulant I gave her forced her system to fight its own biology. Her heart couldn't handle the stress. She died looking at me with those three beautiful amber eyes, and the last thing she said was, "I trust you." I was investigated, cleared of malicious intent but flagged for inadequate xenobiological knowledge. One more mistake, they told me, and my medical license would be revoked permanently. This assignment, 6 months aboard a human vessel, full documentation of their biological peculiarities, was my last chance. If I failed to understand the humans, I was done. So when Captain Hawk showed up in the medical bay that morning looking remarkably alive for someone who'd been clinically dead 7 hours ago, I was ready with my request. "I need to monitor you," I said. "Tonight, while you sleep." He was holding a cup of some dark liquid that smelled like burned carbon and bitter chemicals. He took a long drink, made a satisfied sound, and shrugged. "Sure. Watch if you want. Just don't wake me up again unless the ship is actually on fire. And maybe not even then. I've slept through worse." He walked away whistling some tune I didn't recognize, leaving me alone with my equipment, and the growing certainty that I was about to witness something that would either enlighten me or destroy what was left of my career. Probably both. I spent the day setting up my monitoring array, cardiopulmonary sensors, neural activity scanners, thermal imaging, atmospheric composition analyzers. I cross-referenced every human medical text I could access through the galactic network, reading about circadian rhythms and REM cycles, and something called sleep architecture that sounded more like engineering than biology. The more I read, the less sense it made. Humans, according to their own medical literature, cycle through multiple stages of this sleep process. Light sleep, where they can still be easily woken. Deep sleep, where their muscles relax and their brain waves slow to that terrifying delta pattern I'd seen. And REM, sleep rapid eye movement, where their brains become almost as active as waking consciousness, while their bodies remain completely paralyzed. They deliberately paralyze themselves every night for hours. The medical texts called this atonia and described it as a protective mechanism to prevent people from acting out their dreams, as if that explanation made it any less horrifying, as if the idea of being trapped in your own body while your brain generates vivid hallucinations was somehow normal. There was a note at the bottom of one article, a footnote that made my secondary heart stutter. Some individuals experience sleep paralysis, a condition where consciousness returns before voluntary muscle control. The person is awake but unable to move, often accompanied by hallucinations of a threatening presence in the room. This condition is considered harmless. Being conscious inside your own paralyzed body while your malfunctioning brain generates threats that don't exist was considered harmless. I saved that file. I'd need it later to prove I wasn't having some kind of xenophobic breakdown. At 21:45, I positioned myself in the medical bay with my monitors aimed at Captain Hawk's quarters. He was in there. I could see him on the thermal scan moving around his space in what looked like a pre-shutdown routine. He'd had 3 cups of that bitter chemical beverage throughout the day. I'd watched him consume it with obvious pleasure, and I'd heard him tell the engineer that he really needed a good night's sleep. A chemical stimulant to help achieve unconsciousness faster. The paradox was making my logic centers ache. At 22:03, his thermal signature changed. He'd laid down on his bunk. At 22:05, his heart rate began to drop. I watched the numbers descend with a sick feeling of déjà vu. 80 beats per minute, normal for a resting human. 70, still within acceptable parameters. 65, getting concerning. 60. My primary manipulator was hovering over the emergency alert. 58 beats per minute. On Vaith, that's the heart rate we induce for emergency surgery. That's the threshold where we start preparing the medical team because the patient's body can no longer sustain itself without intervention. That's the number that means you have maybe 30 minutes before permanent damage begins. I forced myself to stay seated, to trust the data, to remember that humans were different. The breathing came next, shallow, irregular, his chest barely moving. The atmospheric sensors in his quarters showed oxygen consumption dropping by 40%. Carbon dioxide production decreasing proportionally. His body was winding down like a machine someone had forgotten to turn off. Then his temperature began to fall. 37 degrees. 36.8. 36.5. 36.1. I'd seen this before. On Lyris. The same progressive shutdown. The same systematic failure of basic homeostatic functions. My hand was actually shaking as I reached for the comm panel. One more drop, one more degree, and I was calling a medical emergency whether Hawk liked it or not. His temperature stabilized at 36.1, held there. The numbers on my screen stopped their terrifying descent and just stayed. His heart rate 52 beats per minute, steady as a metronome. His breathing 14 breaths per minute, shallow but regular. His brain activity long, slow delta waves rolling across my neural scanner like the final readings of a dying star. And then just when I thought I'd catalogued every horror this process had to offer, his motor cortex went silent. Complete atonia. The neural pathways that controlled voluntary movement simply shut down. His muscles went rigid, locked in place by some mechanism I didn't understand. He was trapped, paralyzed, unable to move, unable to cry out, unable to do anything except lie there and wait. For what? For morning. For his brain to decide it was done with whatever processing it was doing, for his body to remember how to be alive again. The worst part came at 23:47. His eyes started moving. I could see it on the infrared scan, rapid, jerky movements beneath his closed eyelids, left, right, up, down, like he was watching something, following something with his gaze. His brain activity exploded into chaos, not waking consciousness. The patterns were all wrong, but something else. Vivid, intense, completely disconnected from reality, neural pathways lighting up in sequences that didn't correspond to any sensory input. Visual cortex active without external stimuli. Emotional centers firing without apparent cause. Memory centers pulling up data and scrambling it into impossible configurations. He was hallucinating. His cooling, paralyzed brain was generating a reality that didn't exist. I watched for 23 minutes as his mind built landscapes that couldn't be twisted. His memories into shapes they'd never held created scenarios that made his heart rate spike and his respiration quicken despite the paralysis holding his body down. This, according to human medical science, was called dreaming, and it was normal, expected, necessary for psychological health. I pulled up my notes on Lyris. The final hours of her life, the readings I'd taken as she slipped away. The similarities were undeniable. Temperature drop, heart rate decrease, brain activity changing to long, slow waves, the body entering a state of profound vulnerability. The only difference was that Lyris never woke up. And humans did this every single night. They walked themselves to this exact edge, teetered there for hours, and somehow impossibly stepped back when morning came. I don't know how long I sat there watching Captain Garrett Hawk's brain paint nightmares against the inside of his skull, while his body lay helpless and cooling in the darkness. But somewhere around 3 o'clock, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to document this. I was going to understand it. Every aspect, every stage, every terrifying, impossible detail. Because if humans could do this, could surrender so completely to something that looked exactly like death and come back stronger, then maybe there was something I'd missed about Lyris. Maybe there was something I could learn that would make her death mean something. Or maybe I was just desperately hoping that understanding one species' impossible biology would somehow absolve me of failing to understand another's. Either way, I wasn't leaving this ship until I knew. The captain stirred at 6:32. I watched his brain activity shift. Delta waves fading, theta emerging, his heart rate climbing slowly, carefully, like his autonomic system was testing each increment before committing. 55, 60, 68, 75. His motor cortex came back online. The paralysis released its grip muscle by muscle nerve cluster by nerve cluster. His hands twitched. His legs shifted. His eyes moved beneath their lids, slower now, more purposeful. At 6:41, he opened his eyes. At 6:42, he sat up. At 6:43, he stretched this full-body extension that made his joints pop in a way that sounded deeply unpleasant and made a satisfied noise. "Best sleep I've had in weeks," he said, to absolutely no one. Then he got up and walked toward the mess hall like he hadn't just spent 8 hours dying. I was still in the medical bay when he passed by. He glanced in, saw me sitting at my monitoring station surrounded by screens full of data, and paused. "You watched all night?" I nodded. My vocabulary had apparently abandoned me somewhere around the 3rd hour of monitoring his hallucinations. "Get any good data?" I looked at my screens, at the graphs showing his descent into what should have been death, at the neural scans of his dreaming brain creating impossible realities, at the temperature readings that matched almost exactly the final hours of Dr. Lyris's life. "Yes," I managed. "I got data." "Good," he smiled. That strange human expression where they show their teeth, but somehow it means friendliness instead of threat. "Breakfast is in 10 minutes. You should eat something. You look terrible." He walked away, whistling again. I sat alone in the medical bay, surrounded by equipment that had just confirmed something impossible, and realized I'd never been more terrified in my entire life. Not because humans were monsters, not because they were dangerous, but because they faced something that looked exactly like death every single night of their existence, and they decided it wasn't worth worrying about. What else, I wondered, had they decided wasn't worth worrying about? Cut. Over the next 4 weeks, I expanded my study. I monitored the engineer Rodriguez. His sleep was loud. He snored this horrible rattling sound that the other humans complained about through the bulkheads, and his dreams seemed to involve a lot of falling based on the full-body jerks that occasionally broke through his paralysis. The navigator, Lieutenant Kira Varlan. She slept curled in a ball, one hand tucked under her face, and her dreams were quieter, gentler. Her heart rate stayed low and steady, her brain activity almost peaceful. I envied her that in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The pilot commander, Sarah Okonkwo. She talked in her sleep. Complete sentences sometimes, though they never made sense. Something about filing the reports before the deadline and the hydraulic pressure is off by 0.3%. Her waking self confirmed she had no memory of these nocturnal declarations. Each human was different, but the pattern was the same. That nightly descent into vulnerability. That surrender to something they couldn't control. That Faith and I was beginning to think of it as faith that their bodies would bring them back. I started recognizing the signs. The way they'd slow down around 2100. The way they'd seek out darker, quieter spaces. The way they'd perform little rituals. Hawk always had a cup of that bitter chemical beverage. I learned it was called coffee exactly 90 minutes before sleep. Rodriguez read technical manuals. Valen listened to music through neural interface, something with a slow, rhythmic beat that made her biometrics stabilize. They were preparing for death, making themselves ready for it, optimizing their approach to the edge. It was the most disturbing routine I'd ever witnessed. But it was also, I was beginning to realize, the most revealing. Because during the day, humans were almost aggressively normal. They laughed. They worked. They bickered over meal rations and whose turn it was to clean the recycler filters. They were just another spacefaring species trying to make their way through an indifferent universe. But every night they proved they were something else entirely. On day 28 of my monitoring at 0347 station time, Captain Garrett Hawke's eyes opened. His heart rate was at 55. His body was still locked in paralysis. His brain activity showed he was awake, alpha waves, conscious processing, active awareness, but his motor cortex remained completely silent. He was experiencing sleep paralysis. I watched on my monitors as he tried to move. Nothing happened. His muscle readings showed attempts to activate neural signals being sent, but the paralysis held firm. His eyes moved the only part of him still responding. Left. Right. Scanning his quarters. His heart rate began to climb. 60, 65, 70. His visual cortex was active, but there was no external input. His brain was generating imagery without stimuli. I'd read about this. The hallucinations that often accompanied sleep paralysis. The feeling of a presence in the room. Something malevolent. Something threatening. I could see his quarters on thermal scan. He was alone, but his brain didn't know that. His brain, still partially locked in the dreaming state, was creating threats that didn't exist and showing them to him while he lay helpless and unable to move. His heart rate hit 80, 90. 4 minutes passed. 4 minutes of him trapped in his own body, conscious but paralyzed, seeing things that weren't there and unable to do anything about it. I had my hand on the emergency comm, ready to call for help, ready to intervene, ready to do something. But I'd learned, I'd studied, I'd read the footnote in the medical text. This condition is considered harmless. At minute 5, his motor cortex flickered back to life. His hands moved first. Just a twitch, then his legs, then his arms. The paralysis released him section by section, and he sat up breathing hard, one hand pressed against his chest. He looked around his quarters, at the empty corners where something had stood in his hallucinating mind, at the shadows that had held threats that didn't exist. Then he lay back down and closed his eyes. At 6:41 he woke up normally and headed to breakfast. I found him in the mess hall at 7 o'clock. He was drinking coffee, scrolling through maintenance reports on a datapad, looking completely fine. "Captain," I said, "last night, at 3:47, you experienced sleep paralysis." He looked up, blinked. "Oh, yeah. Happens sometimes." "Creepy as hell, but nothing serious." "You were conscious but paralyzed for 4.7 minutes. Your brain generated hallucinations. I monitored your heart rate spike to 92 beats per minute." "Sounds about right." He took another sip of coffee. "It's just my brain waking up before my body does. Weird, but harmless." Harmless. There was that word again. The word humans used to describe being trapped in their own paralyzed bodies while their malfunctioning brains created nightmares. "You're okay with this?" I asked, "with experiencing what appears to be a catastrophic system failure on a regular basis?" Hawke smiled. "Zephon, it's just biology. Creepy biology, sure, but it doesn't hurt me. Doesn't cause any damage. It's just one of those things that happens when you're a species that needs to shut down for 8 hours a day." He went back to his maintenance reports. I stood there holding my datapad and realized something that made my primary heart skip. Humans didn't just survive this nightly death. They'd adapted to it so completely that they couldn't imagine being afraid of it. The sleep paralysis that would send most species into existential crisis was to them just creepy but harmless. What else had they adapted to? What else had they normalized? What other impossible things did they face with this same casual acceptance? I was about to find out. Because 3 days later, at 14:32 station time, an emergency transmission came through from Orbital Medical Hub Theta 9. Severe trauma, human crew, multiple casualties. And Captain Hawk turned to me with that same easy smile and said, "You wanted to see humans at our limits, Doc. Looks like you're about to get your chance." Being told. 4 weeks after I started monitoring human sleep patterns, I submitted my transfer request to Orbital Medical Hub Theta 9. The request went through in 6 hours, record time, which told me exactly what the Galactic Assembly thought of my research so far, not much. They wanted me somewhere I could be useful, and apparently useful meant the massive trauma center orbiting the Theta system's primary trade hub. Captain Hawk found me in my quarters packing my equipment into transport cases. "You sure about this, Zephon?" He was leaning against the doorframe, coffee cup in hand. Always the coffee. I'd started to associate that bitter smell with humans preparing for the impossible. Theta 9 is rough. We're talking combat casualties, industrial accidents, decompression incidents. It's not a research posting. It's a war zone with medical equipment. I sealed the case containing my neural scanners. I need to see humans at their limits. "You've been watching us sleep for a month. I'd say you've seen us pretty vulnerable." "That's different." I turned to face him. "Sleep is something you do willingly, habitually. I need to see what happens when circumstances force you past where you choose to go." He was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his coffee and pulled something from his pocket. A small data chip. "Medical override codes," he said, "for the hub's emergency systems. Technically, you shouldn't have these, but if you're going to study humans at their worst, you might need to access records that are usually restricted." He paused. "Just be careful, Doc. What you're going to see there, it's different from watching someone peacefully sleep through the night. It's messier, harder to categorize." I took the chip. "Captain, I watched your species rehearse for death every night for 28 days. I think I can handle." "That's not what I mean." His expression shifted to something I hadn't seen before, something that looked almost like concern. "Sleep is natural. What you're about to see is what happens when the universe tries to kill us and we refuse to cooperate. It's not always pretty, and it doesn't always work." He left me with that. I spent my last night on the Perseverance reviewing the data I'd collected. Hundreds of hours of humans surrendering to unconsciousness. Thousands of biometric readings showing impossible survival. Page after page of notes, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I'd been trained to understand about organic life. And underneath all of it, a single file I kept coming back to. Dr. Lyris. Final medical report. I'd pulled it up 17 times in the past month. Read through the timeline of her death. The moment I'd administered the stimulant. The way her heart rate had spiked. The cascade failure that followed. The exact timestamp when her 3 amber eyes had dimmed, and I'd realized what I'd done. 20:47:23. That's when she died. I knew because I'd been watching the chrono, desperately hoping that medical would arrive in time. They hadn't. Her last words were still in my auditory memory. Perfect, clear, haunting. "I trust you. I trust you, and you killed me." The transport to Theta 9 took 11 hours. I spent them trying not to think about Lyris, trying not to wonder if I was about to make another mistake that would cost someone their life, trying to convince myself that understanding humans would somehow balance the scales. It didn't work. The guilt followed me across 3 systems and stayed with me when I reported for duty at the hub. Orbital Medical Hub. Theta 9 was everything Captain Hawk had warned me about, and worse. The main trauma bay was a cathedral of suffering. 40 beds arranged in a circle around a central surgical theatre. every species I'd ever studied, and a dozen I hadn't, all damaged in ways that made my medical training feel inadequate. Burns, lacerations, decompression trauma, radiation poisoning, the thick smell of disinfectant barely covering the organic scents of blood, and worse things. I was assigned to xenobiology consultation. My job was to identify species-specific complications and advise the emergency teams. It was important work, necessary work. It was also mind-numbingly routine. For 3 weeks, I catalogued injuries, advised on metabolic differences, confirmed that yes, Krinth really do need to hibernate, and no, you absolutely cannot give them stimulants. That last one stung every time. I was starting to think my transfer had been a waste. The humans who came through were remarkable in their resilience. Broken bones, they shrugged off infections they fought through, but nothing that challenged my understanding, nothing that pushed me past the boundaries of what I'd already seen. Then, day 21 happened. I was reviewing xenochemistry texts in the consultation bay, half listening to the ambient noise of the trauma center, when the emergency klaxon shattered my concentration. Incoming emergency vessel UNS Defiant. Multiple casualties. Human crew. The main doors burst open 90 seconds later. 3 humans rushed in. 2 of them were supporting a third who sat in a mobile stabilization chair, head tilted back at an angle that immediately registered as wrong. Blood covered the right side of her face, not dripping, pouring. Arterial red and far too much of it. The emergency team converged. I grabbed my scanner and moved closer. Then I saw what was causing the bleeding. A metal rod, jagged, irregular, approximately 15 millimeters in diameter, embedded directly into her right orbital socket, angled upward, disappearing into her skull. My scanner activated automatically. The readings populated my display in that cold, clinical way that medical equipment has. Numbers that should have been describing a corpse. Entry point, right orbit. Penetration depth, 8 centimeters. Trajectory. Frontal lobe, specifically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Tissue damage. 14% of total brain mass. Blood loss, approximately 400 milliliters and ongoing. Cardiac function active. Heart rate 66 beats per minute. Respiratory function active. 14 breaths per minute. Neural activity active. Conscious level brainwaves detected. I cross-referenced the readings 3 times. Checked my scanner's calibration, ran a diagnostic on my own processing because clearly something was malfunctioning. Nothing was malfunctioning. The human with 8 centimeters of metal embedded in her frontal lobe was alive, was conscious, was, "Hey, Doc." The voice came from the patient. Her one functional eye rolled toward me, unfocused but determined. Blood traced red lines down her cheek, her jaw, her neck. The metal rod moved slightly when she spoke, and I watched fresh blood well around the entry wound. "I think I got something stuck in my face." My primary and secondary hearts stopped, just stopped. For a full 2 seconds, my circulatory system forgot how to function because my processing center was too busy trying to comprehend what I was seeing. A human, with a foreign object penetrating 14% of her brain mass, making a joke. "Do you feel pain?" The question came out as a whisper. My translator barely caught it. Her functional eye squinted. She seemed to consider the question with the same casual detachment I'd used to evaluate whether I wanted tea or water. "Nah. Brain shuts that off when it's bad." She paused. A thin trickle of blood ran from the corner of her mouth. "I'll feel it later, when the shock wears off." When the shock wears off. As if that was normal, as if the human body could simply decide not to experience agony and have that decision obeyed. One of her companions stepped forward, younger, male. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. "We can compartmentalize. Focus on what's important." She's focusing on staying upright. The pain comes later. The emergency team was already moving, stabilizing the rod, starting fluids, prepping for transport to surgery. And I was standing there, scanner in hand, watching a human who should have been dead 12 different ways continue to breathe, continue to think, continue to crack jokes about the piece of metal destroying her brain. The room tilted. I felt my limbs go weak, heard someone calling my name from very far away, saw the floor rushing up to meet me. I fainted. When I came to, I was on one of the consultation beds. The emergency team had moved on, presumably taking their impossible patient to surgery. But standing next to my bed, looking down at me with genuine concern in her one functional eye, was the human with the metal rod through her brain. "You okay, Doc?" I tried to sit up, failed, tried again, managed it on the third attempt. "You're asking if I'm okay? There's a..." My translator was having trouble keeping up with the speed of my thoughts. "Your brain is impaled." "Yeah, we're going to fix that." She smiled. The expression pulled at the wound and fresh blood appeared. "But you looked pretty rough there for a second. Didn't know Vathari could faint." "We can't. Normally. This is your..." I stopped, took 3 deliberate breaths, forced my processing center to slow down. "What's your name?" "Lieutenant Kira Vex, Combat Medic, UNS Defiant." She extended her hand. The gesture seemed absurd given the circumstances, but I took it. Her grip was firm, steady. "Nice to meet you, Doc. Sorry about the mess." She was apologizing to me for bleeding while a metal rod was still embedded in her brain. "Lieutenant Vex," I said carefully, "I need to get you to surgery. Immediately." "Yeah, I figured." She glanced toward the surgical theater. "They said you're the xenobio specialist. You gonna be there during the operation?" "Aye, yes, if you want me there." "Good." She nodded. The rod shifted again. I watched with horrified fascination as it moved with her skull. "You seem like you care. I trust you. I trust you." Lyris's last words. My manipulator limbs started shaking. The surgery took 4 hours and 17 minutes. I was scrubbed in as xenobiology consultant, but really I was there because Lieutenant Kira Vex had asked me to be. Because somehow impossibly this human with a foreign object in her brain had decided I was trustworthy. I couldn't let her down. Not again. Not like Lyris. The lead surgeon was a Kelthran named Dr. Vaith, all 6 of her arms moving with practiced precision. She walked me through the procedure as we worked. The rod entered through the orbital socket, which actually worked in our favor. Bone fragments. Yes, but they've displaced rather than being driven deeper. The penetration missed the optic nerve by 2 millimeters. She's losing the eye, but the visual cortex is intact. I was monitoring Vex's neural activity, watching the patterns shift and change as we worked. The frontal lobe damage. Extensive. We're looking at severed neural pathways, displaced tissue blood pooling in areas that should be sterile. In most species, this would be catastrophic, fatal even with immediate intervention. But not humans. But not humans. Vaith's primary arm held the rod steady, while her secondary arms worked around it with tools that looked far too delicate for the task at hand. Their neural plasticity is remarkable. The brain will reroute, compensate, find new pathways. She'll need rehabilitation, yes, cognitive therapy, but she'll survive. I watched my monitors as we began the extraction. Each millimeter was a calculated risk. The rod was jagged, torn from whatever equipment had birthed it. Every movement threatened to cause additional damage. Vex's heart rate never wavered. 66 beats per minute, steady as a metronome. Fragment 3, Vaith announced. Serrated edge, 2 millimeters from the motor cortex. If I slip even 0.5 millimeters left, she'll lose motor control on her right side. Exactly. I looked at the surgical field, at Vex's exposed brain tissue, at the blood and the damage and the impossibility of what we were attempting. And I thought about sleep, about how humans surrendered to something that looked like death every night and came back stronger. Maybe this was the same principle. Maybe humans had learned to dance so close to death that even when it pierced their brains, they could find their way back. Vaith extracted the final fragment at hour 3, minute 42. The rod came free in 7 pieces, each one catalogued and removed with mechanical precision. What was left was a wound that by all medical standards should have been a death sentence. Vex's brainwaves remained active, conscious level, dreaming, even if the REM patterns I was seeing meant what I thought they meant. She was asleep. During brain surgery, experiencing that nightly death I'd spent a month studying. Her heart rate 48 beats per minute, lower than I'd ever seen during my monitoring, but steady, stable. Closing now, Vaith said. Bone reconstruction, tissue repair, seal and sterilize. The final hour was almost routine, almost boring compared to the extraction. We rebuilt the orbit, sealed the blood vessels, cleaned the surgical field, and closed the incisions with care. At hour 4 minutes 17, we stepped back. Well, Vaith said, all 6 arms relaxing simultaneously. She's alive. Improbably, impossibly alive. But alive. I stayed in post-op while Vex recovered, watched her vitals, monitored her brain activity, and tried not to think about how similar this felt to watching humans sleep. Except this time, there was surgical trauma instead of voluntary surrender. She woke at hour 6 post-surgery. Her one remaining eye opened, focused on me with remarkable clarity for someone who'd just had 14% of their brain damaged. How bad? You lost the eye. Frontal lobe damage will require rehabilitation. Neural pathways are compromised but compensating. Prognosis for full recovery 73%. She absorbed this, blinked her one eye, then got that cybernetic eye catalogue I've been wanting to upgrade anyway. The military models with the targeting software. Those look fun. I stared at her, at this human who'd just lost a major sensory organ and was talking about upgrades like she was shopping for equipment. You want targeting software? Hell yeah. If I'm going to lose an eye, might as well get something useful out of it. I pulled up the catalogue on my datapad, showed her the options, watched her scroll through them with her one organic eye, comparing specifications and features like this was a routine purchase. This one, she said, pointing to a model with integrated tactical displays. This is the one I want. I made a note in her file, tried to keep my voice professional. I'll submit the requisition. Thanks, Doc. She settled back into the recovery bed. Her vitals were already stabilizing, heart rate back to 64, temperature rising to normal human range. You did good work today. I'm glad you were there. I trust you. But this time the person who trusted me was still alive. I ran a full body scan while Vex slept that night. Standard protocol for major trauma cases. What I found made me pull up her complete medical history and read it 3 times. Left leg prosthetic, military grade. Rocket-assisted propulsion system. Installed 7 months ago following catastrophic damage during a boarding action. Right arm reinforced bone structure. Medical history showed 9 separate fractures, all healed with enhanced calcium deposits that made the bones 40% stronger than baseline human. Torso scar tissue following nerve paths. Old injuries carefully repaired. Skin grafts covered 12% of her surface area. Internal organs. 1 kidney synthetic. Installed 3 years ago. spine reinforced with metallic supports at L3 and L4 vertebrae. Medical history summary. 3 clinical deaths. 7 major reconstructive surgeries. 14 separate instances of trauma requiring hospitalization. She was 29 standard years old. I pulled up the files on her crewmates. The 2 who'd brought her in ran their scans. The pilot, no legs below the knee, full cybernetic lower body with integrated thruster systems. Medical history, crushed in a hull breach. Died twice during surgery. Currently rated for zero-gravity combat operations. The engineer synthetic lungs, both of them. Medical history. Chemical exposure. Organic lung tissue destroyed. Reconstruction took 8 months. Currently capable of surviving in atmosphere compositions that would kill baseline humans. This wasn't a crew. This was a collection of beings who'd been broken so thoroughly that it was difficult to tell where the original biology ended and the repairs began. And they didn't see it as tragedy. They saw it as adaptation, improvement, survival. I thought about sleep, about humans surrendering to death every night and emerging unchanged. But this was different. This was death that left marks, death that took pieces and forced humans to rebuild with whatever they could find. And they did rebuild, every time. Better than before. Lieutenant Kira Vex was discharged 6 days later. She walked out on her prosthetic leg, her new cybernetic eye already calibrating to her neural patterns. The bandages on her face were coming off because she'd said they itched and she was tired of waiting. She found me in the consultation bay, shook my manipulator limb with her organic hand. "Thanks, Doc. You're not so bad for someone who faints at the sight of blood." "I don't normally." "I'm kidding." She grinned. "But seriously, you helped save my life. That means something." I watched her walk away, watched her vanish into the crowded corridors of the hub with her 2 crewmates, all 3 of them more machine than biology, all 3 of them laughing about something I couldn't hear. And I made my decision. I submitted a transfer request that night. Destination Combat Zone Observation Program. Assignment: document human biology under extreme circumstances. Duration: indefinite. The request was approved in 8 hours. Captain Hawk sent me a message. Just 3 words: "Stay safe, Doc." I packed my equipment, said goodbye to the emergency team at Theta 9, and headed for the transport that would take me to the front lines of the Assembly's war with the Drev Empire. Because if humans could lose eyes and treat it as an opportunity for upgrades, if they could have metal driven through their brains and joke about it, if they could die 3 times and come back stronger each time, then I needed to see what happened when an entire army of them faced an enemy that specialized in killing. I needed to understand not just how humans survived. I needed to understand what they became when survival wasn't enough. The combat observation vessel was called the Silent Watch, appropriate name for a ship designed to hover at the edge of battlefields and record the ways species tried to kill each other. I'd been aboard for 8 weeks when the Drev Empire made their move on the Karvik Valley. The briefing came at 0400 station time. I was reviewing xenobiological data, trying not to think about Lieutenant Vex and her targeting software eye when Commander Varys appeared on my display. "Dr. Zephon, we've got activity in Sector 7. Drev forces engaging assembly positions. Human contingent is deployed. 40 soldiers. You wanted to see humans under extreme circumstances." She paused. "You're about to get your wish." The holographic display activated, showing me the valley from orbital perspective. Lush, green, the kind of place that would be beautiful if it wasn't about to become a graveyard. Human forces were dug in along the western ridge. 40 thermal signatures arranged in defensive positions that looked inadequate against what was coming. Because what was coming was 200 Drev warriors. I'd studied the Drev, six-limbed apex predators from a high-gravity world, exoskeletons that could shrug off plasma fire, strength enough to rip bulkhead plating bare-handed. They'd been the undisputed military power in this sector for 400 years. The Assembly had been losing to them for the past 18 months. Badly. The first Drev crested the eastern ridge at 0447. I watched through the observation sensors as the battle began, watched humans open fire with weapons that seemed inadequate against those armored bodies, watched Drev warriors charge down the slope with speed that shouldn't have been possible for creatures that size. The fighting lasted 9 minutes. When it was over, 31 humans were down. Not wounded. Down. The kind of damage that my medical training recognized as incompatible with life. Limbs torn away, bodies broken, blood turning the Green Valley floor dark. The remaining 9 humans retreated. The Drev held the valley. Victory was absolute. I watched the casualty feeds populate my display, watched the names and the damage assessments and the clinical notation KIA, killed in action, 31 times. And I thought about Lyris, about watching her die, about how I'd been powerless to stop it. I was watching it happen again, 31 times, and there was nothing I could do but record the data and try not to feel like I was complicit in their deaths just by observing. I shut down my station, went to my quarters, tried to enter my rest cycle, failed. For the first time in my life, I understood why humans sought unconsciousness, why they surrendered to sleep every night. Because consciousness meant remembering, meant seeing those 31 thermal signatures wink out, meant knowing that I'd asked to see this and now I had to live with what I'd seen. 3 weeks later, the alarms woke me from something that wasn't quite rest but wasn't quite consciousness either. "Dr. Zephon, you need to see this." Commander Varys sounded different, uncertain. That got my attention faster than the alarms. I made it to the observation deck in 90 seconds. The holographic display showed the same valley, the same Drev positions, and approaching from the west, 40 human signatures. "Reinforcements?" I asked. Varys shook her head. "No, those are the same soldiers, same ID tags, same biometric profiles." I looked at the display, at the signatures that should have been corpses 3 weeks ago. "That's impossible." "Yeah, that's what the Drev are saying too." The Drev commander was named Thrakos. I knew because our intelligence had been tracking him for 6 months. Aged warrior, veteran of 100 battles, had personally led the campaigns that pushed the Assembly back across 4 systems. He was standing on the eastern ridge when the first human crested the western slope. I watched through our sensors, watched Thrakos's thermal signature go still, watched him raise one manipulator limb, the Drev gesture for halt, and his warriors stopped advancing. Because the human climbing that ridge was Sergeant Cole. I recognized his biometric signature, recognized it because 3 weeks ago I'd watched the Drev tear him apart, literally, limbs from body, the kind of trauma that left no doubt about the outcome. But Sergeant Cole was walking up that hill, and he wasn't broken anymore. He was better, where his legs had been polished steel, not crude prosthetics, integrated systems, rocket-assisted thrusters built into the calves. I could see the heat signatures of the power cells, where his arms had been titanium frameworks, weapons integrated directly into the structure. No need to hold a rifle when your forearm was the rifle. Where his eyes had been glowing optical sensors, multiple spectrum capability. I watched them sweep across the Drev positions with mechanical precision, cataloging threats, calculating angles. His torso showed reinforced plating. His spine had been replaced with something that registered as composite alloy. His heart, I could see it on thermal, was beating with perfect mechanical rhythm. 60 beats per minute, steady as it had been when he was fully organic. Behind him, 30 more signatures. each one showing similar modifications. The pilot with no legs now equipped with full aerial thrust capability. The medic with synthetic lungs now able to operate in atmosphere that would kill baseline humans. The engineer with integrated tool systems built into her prosthetic arms. They'd taken every injury the Drev had inflicted. Every wound. Every piece of themselves they'd lost. And they'd rebuilt better. By the ancestors, I whispered. They evolved. In 3 weeks, Varys said. 3 weeks from catastrophic casualties to this. The Drev charged. I watched what happened next with something approaching religious awe. The warriors who'd torn through human defenses 3 weeks ago found their claws scraping uselessly against titanium bones. Their powerful strikes, blows that could crack starship hulls, glanced off armored rib cages. The humans had replaced their lungs with mechanical bellows that never tired. Their hearts with synthetic pumps that didn't know fear. Their lost legs with thrusters that let them fly. Sergeant Cole moved through the Drev lines like physics had become optional. His rocket-assisted legs carried him 3 meters in a single bound. His integrated weapons fired with computer-assisted accuracy. His synthetic spine absorbed impacts that would have shattered organic vertebrae. And behind him, 30 others doing the same, each one a patchwork of flesh and machine, each one refusing to accept that losing pieces meant losing the fight. The battle lasted 4 minutes. The Drev retreated. I sat in my observation chair watching the thermal signatures of defeated Drev warriors flee across the valley they'd held for 3 weeks and realized something that made my primary heart skip. This wasn't war. This was evolution under pressure, and humans had just demonstrated that they could evolve faster than any species had a right to. "Commander," I said quietly, "how long until the Drev figure out what just happened? Based on their communications?" Varys checked her display. "They already know. Threkos just sent a priority transmission to Drev High Command. Translation reads, 'We didn't lose to a stronger enemy, we lost to one that refuses to stay dead.'" The war turned after Karvik Valley. I watched it happen over the next 6 weeks. Watched the Drev win battles, inflict casualties, push human forces back, and then watch those same humans return, upgraded, enhanced, better than they'd been before. Every wound became an opportunity. Every loss became fuel for improvement. A soldier lost a leg. She returned with rocket propulsion. Lost an eye. Returned with a targeting computer wired into her visual cortex. Lost an arm. Returned with a weapon platform that made her more effective than she'd been with organic limbs. The Drev had spent 400 years defining themselves by conquest. They'd never encountered an enemy that saw crippling injury not as a death sentence, but as an invitation to transcend biology. By week 12, the Drev were in full retreat across 7 systems. By week 14, Commander Threkos sent a ceasefire request. By week 18, I watched the formal surrender on my observation display. Threkos knelt on a smoking battlefield. Around him, the remnants of his command lay broken. Not dead, the humans had been careful about that, but defeated. Thoroughly, completely. Above him stood Sergeant Cole. 1 arm, no legs, no organic eyes. His body was 60% machine, now held together by will and circuitry more than biological processes. His chest rose and fell with mechanical precision. His heart beat with synthetic rhythm. His remaining organic hand hung at his side. He should have been a corpse a dozen times over. Instead, he stood as victor. I watched, holding my breath in a way Vathari don't normally do, as Cole extended that organic hand toward the kneeling Drev commander. The gesture was small, simple, but I understood its weight. Threkos looked up at the human who'd refused to die, at the creature his warriors had torn apart, and who'd returned stronger. At the living proof that humans didn't win through superior strength or numbers. They won through refusal. Thrykos's voice came through the comms. Rough. Tired. We conquered for millennia. What are you? Cole's response was quiet. We survived for millennia. There's a difference. Thrykos stared at that extended hand, at the possibility of mercy from an enemy who had every right to demand annihilation. Then he reached up. His massive claw touched Cole's palm, and in that moment the war ended. Not with weapons, not with treaties, but with understanding. 6 months later, I stood in Captain Garrett Hawke's quarters aboard the Perseverance. I'd submitted my final report. 10,000 pages documenting human resilience adaptation and the systematic refusal to accept biological limitations. The Assembly had accepted it, cleared my record, restored my medical license without restrictions. I was free to go wherever I wanted, study whatever species I chose, but I'd requested to return here, to this ship, to these humans who'd shown me something I was still trying to understand. Hawke was making coffee, that bitter chemical beverage that smelled like burned carbon and tasted worse. He poured 2 cups, offered me one. Final verdict on us crazy death sleepers, he asked. I took the cup, didn't drink yet, just held it and let the heat seep into my manipulator limbs. You're the most terrifying species I've studied. Because we're violent. No. I set the cup down. Because you refused to accept limits. Hawke smiled. That's a feature, not a bug. I know. I think I finally understand that. I paused. Captain, 6 months ago, I killed someone. A colleague. Her name was Dr. Lyris. She was Crinth, entering a hibernation cycle, and I gave her stimulants because I didn't understand what was happening. Hawke's expression shifted. Zephon. She died because I was ignorant, because I thought I knew better than her biology. Because I was afraid of watching her slip away, and I acted instead of understanding. The words came faster now. And then I came here. Watched you surrender to something that looked exactly like death. Watched Lieutenant Vex survive a metal rod through her brain. Watched soldiers die and return as something more than they'd been. And I realized something. What's that? I didn't kill Lyris. I killed what she was becoming. I picked up the coffee again. Humans taught me that. You showed me that breaking doesn't mean ending. That death can be a transition instead of a terminus. That the only real failure is refusing to adapt. Hawke was quiet for a moment. Then, you planning to drink that coffee or just hold it? I looked at the cup. At the dark liquid that humans consumed to help them achieve their nightly death faster. At the chemical that had become a symbol of their casual relationship with things that should kill them. I drank it. It was terrible. Bitter. Harsh. It made my secondary stomach clench in protest. I took another sip. It gets better, Hawke said. Eventually. I doubt that. But I kept drinking. That night, I accessed the restricted archives of Vathari medical history. The ones that required special clearance. The ones that my species had decided weren't relevant to modern practice. I found what I was looking for in a file dated 2,000 years ago. Ancestral Vathari possessed a dormant cycle capability. Subjects would enter a state of reduced consciousness lasting 6 to 8 hours, during which metabolic processes decreased by 60% and neural activity shifted to long-wave patterns consistent with memory consolidation and cellular repair. The practice was systematically eliminated through genetic modification in the year 2847 by the Vathari Council of Biological Integrity. Reasoning dormancy represented an evolutionary weakness. Conscious awareness was deemed superior to unconscious vulnerability. 2,000 years ago, my species had looked at something that resembled sleep and decided it was weakness, had eliminated it, had chosen to remain forever conscious rather than surrender to the vulnerability of rest. We could have been like humans, could have learned to dance with death every night, could have found strength in the willingness to be vulnerable. But we chose fear instead. I closed the file, sat in the darkness of my quarters, and made a decision. At 2200 station time, I went to the medical bay. Hawk was there preparing for his nightly death. He looked surprised to see me. "Doc, everything okay?" "Captain, I need to ask you something. It's going to sound strange. I've had 31 conversations with you about why humans sleep. Strange is relative at this point. Can you teach me to sleep?" He stared at me. "You're serious?" "Completely. My species..." "We used to have dormant cycles. We eliminated them. But I think we were wrong. I think we threw away something important because we were afraid." Hawk set down his coffee. "Zephon, you know, Vathari biology isn't designed for sleep anymore. It's been 2,000 years. The genetic modifications..." "I know. But Lieutenant Vex showed me that biology isn't destiny, that humans rebuild themselves all the time. That adaptation is a choice, not just a response." I met his eyes. "I want to learn how to surrender, how to let go, how to trust that I'll come back." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. "That's the craziest thing I've heard you say. And I once heard you scream because you thought my coffee was poison." "It is poison." "Yeah, but it's good poison." He pulled up a medical interface. "Okay. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Modified sleep pod, monitored environment. I'll be watching your vitals the whole time. Like I watched yours." "Exactly like that. Except I'm not going to panic and wake you up when your heart rate drops." He helped me into the pod, adjusted the settings for Vathari physiology, set the monitoring equipment, and then stood back looking at me with something that might have been pride. "Ready?" "No, but do it anyway." The pod activated. The environment shifted. Temperature dropping, oxygen levels adjusting. A mild sedative in the atmosphere, just enough to help my overactive nervous system consider the possibility of rest. I felt my heart rate begin to slow. 140 beats per minute, 130, 120. My vision started to blur. My thoughts became less sharp, less urgent. The constant need for stimulation, for data, for proof that the universe was still operating correctly. It faded, 100 beats per minute. I could hear Hawk's voice, distant but steady. "You're doing great, Zephon. Heart rate is stable. Brain activity is shifting. Just let it happen." 90 beats per minute. I thought about Lyris, about her last words. "I trust you." And I realized that trust wasn't about being right all the time. It was about being willing to be wrong, to fail, to fall, and to believe you'd be caught. 80 beats per minute. The world was fading, not ending, just softening, like someone had turned down the volume on existence. My last conscious thought before the darkness took me was simple. Maybe dying a little every night is how you learn to truly live. I woke 8 hours later. My hearts were beating, slow, steady, 70 beats per minute, lower than I'd ever experienced while conscious. Hawk was sitting next to the pod, coffee in hand, monitors showing my vitals. "Welcome back, Doc." I sat up. Everything felt different, slower, calmer, like my nervous system had been reset. "Did it work?" "You tell me." "How do you feel?" I considered the question, ran diagnostics on my own systems, checked my memory integration, my processing speed, my sensory acuity. Everything was sharper, clearer, more focused. I feel, I paused, better, rested, like my system finally got to stop running for a few hours. Hawk smiled. Yeah, that's what sleep does. Welcome to the club of species that surrender to death every night. I climbed out of the pod, stood on legs that felt steadier than they had in months, and looked at Captain Garrett Hawk, this human who'd let me watch him die every night for a month, who'd trusted me to understand something my species had forgotten. Thank you, I said. For what? For teaching me that breaking doesn't mean ending, that surrender can be strength, that the only way to transcend your limits is to acknowledge them first. He raised his coffee cup. To limits, and to the crazy bastards who refuse to accept them. I raised my own cup, still half full of terrible bitter coffee, and drank. The humans didn't win because they were the strongest species in the galaxy. They won because when the universe said, "You're broken," they said, "We're upgraded." When death came knocking, they opened the door, learned its patterns, and made it their training partner. When their bodies failed, they rebuilt with whatever they could find and emerged better than before. And every single night they proved that dying a little, surrendering completely to vulnerability, was how you learn to truly live. The species that refuses to die didn't conquer the galaxy. They taught it how to survive.